we are joined by Dr. Gerald Horne, historian and author of more than 30 books, and the epic White Supremacy Confronted, to discuss NATO and Africa, a relationship of colonial and structural white supremacy. And Gerald, greetings.
Thank you for inviting me.
Always our pleasure, our honor. Gerald, African leaders at the recent summit held by Biden said that it is they who will sit at the drawing board and design their continental, economical, cultural, political future, while suggesting that NATO instigated the Ukraine crisis and demanding Biden not punish African nations by pressuring them to cut ties with Moscow. And this is amidst the 3-century-old colonial practice, they said, of division with the purpose to reign and exploit the continent ends. And they said, and most strongly stated by the South African president, they will no longer be followed by U.S. as acolytes, but rather, again, design their own future. So the issue is, are we talking about the question of self-determination when we look at the critiques of the Putin's relationship, or as the New York Times in a 3-page article said, Putin wants fealty and he's founded in Africa. So is the issue about self-determination that we should be advocating, or is it more than that and really understanding the nature of the NATO relationship and the nature of Russia's relationship?
Well, first of all, your audience in New York, at least in Southeast Queens, have a particular stake in this matter.
Indeed.
Your Congressman, Gregory Meeks, who is chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who has carried legislation which would seek to punish African nations that refuse to go along with the U.S. policy on Ukraine. This is a clear and blatant example of the attempt to deny self-determination to the continent. But Washington is in a kind of quandary and bind because, as Washington sees it, China and Russia have made significant inroads into Africa in terms of diplomatic relations, in terms of trade relations in particular. And Washington and its North Atlantic allies historically have seen the African continent as a kind of preserve that helps to boost their own economies. You need look no further than the streets of New York and New Jersey, where you see millions of people of African descent, a direct outgrowth of the unlamented African slave trade. And so when Mr. Biden in December 2022 called together this summit of African leaders, he was responding, in a sense, not only to the perceived challenge from Beijing and Moscow, but also trying to reassert the U.S. authority over the continent. And I should also say that it's not just Beijing and Moscow that Washington is concerned about. Flying under the radar, if you like, is the NATO member that is Turkey, which is seen not necessarily in Washington as a consistent ally. You may know that in nations of Africa that have Muslim populations, particularly the Muslim majorities, Turkey, which is a predominantly Islamic nation, has played a significant role. For example, in Somalia, on the Horn of Africa, where U.S. policies sent that East African nation into a spiral of declension, you see that Turkey is the power behind the throne, attending to everything from garbage pickup to airport security. And then if you look at India, which Washington is trying to court and curry favor with, if you look at the East African region along the Indian Ocean coast, stretching from Mombasa in Kenya down through Dar es Salaam in Tanzania all the way down to Durban in South Africa, you'll notice that there is a substantial South Asian diaspora, Indian diaspora, if you like, which gives New Delhi a kind of natural inroad into Africa. And so Washington is finding that it's being challenged. That brings us to the state visit of French President Emmanuel Macron just a few weeks ago. Recall that it is Africa that gives France this pretension of being a major power. If you look at the region formerly known as Francophone Africa, I'm speaking of Guinea-Conakry, Mali, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, all the way down to the southeast of Madagascar, you'll see that France still plays a preeminent, if not a predominant role in a good deal of Africa. But the problem for France is that it has had to rely more heavily upon Washington in order to carry out its imperial designs. But Washington is a stern partner and has been exacting major concessions from France as a result, which then compromises France when the time comes, as it did in Washington during this state visit, for France to carry water for the European Union and reprimand Washington for the Inflation Reduction Act, which France, the European Union, sees as providing subsidies to U.S. corporations to the detriment of French and EU corporations. And that's not to mention the fact that with the Ukraine conflict and the decision by the European nations to boycott Russian energy, this has put a premium on African energy, speaking of Algerian natural gas, Nigerian petroleum, Angolan petroleum, etc. But France, a nation with a population of a mere 65 million, finds it difficult to carry out its imperial designs and therefore has to rely upon Washington for assistance, which then once again compromises that when the time comes for France to put its own demands and European Union demands to Washington, particularly since Washington, in light of the boycott of Russian energy, has been profiting handsomely by selling Texas, Louisiana natural gas into the European market, not to mention selling U.S. petroleum into the European market. So this is the backdrop for this summit that took place just a few weeks ago in Washington, where these African leaders were called together. And I should add the major footnote that it was not all African leaders who were called together, because conspicuously absent from the summit was the Zimbabwean leader, Emmerson Mnangagwa. You know that Zimbabwe has been under crushing and punishing sanctions for years now, exacted by Washington, London, Australia, and their allies, because Zimbabwe had the gumption and audacity to try to reverse the fruits of settler colonialism by reclaiming the land that had been pilfered illicitly by European invaders at the end of the 19th century. Washington found it necessary to punish Zimbabwe as a result, because it was felt that not only served as a dangerous precedent for South Africa to move in a similar direction to reclaim the land, but also Namibia, not to mention the ultimate settler colonial regime in North America. Speaking of the United States of America, which continues to rest upon a grand theft of Native American land.
You know, it's interesting to me. I keep going back to, in my own mind, Dr. Walter Rodney's book, which described really the early foundation of colonial Africa's relationship with NATO, which continues today. The classic book, it was written, in 1972, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And so I just want to contrast that for a moment again against this, I thought, extraordinary 3 full pages in the New York Times that were just published, where they say, but Putin's Russia, by contrast, never builds a bridge. It is the master of pitiless protection services, plunder, and propaganda. It was the friends, though through hard power, now extended to more than a dozen African countries, including Mali and Sudan. As in Syria, its readiness to use force to secure the outcome it seeks. So I want you, if you can, just again to delve into the continued exploration of the role that NATO has played and that NATO is playing now through AFRICOM, and then look at this question of, has Africa really just sought to haplessly replace a U.S. colonialist and exploitative endeavor with Russia, who is playing the same role? Is that really the issue? And how do you parse out those concerns for us? And again, the extraordinary article that appeared in the New York Times. I mean, it's unusual that they have a 3 full-page piece, which, of course, tries to alienate the world's population from Russia in general and using Africa as the backdrop.
Well, it is well that you mentioned that lengthy article in the New York Times a few days ago that focused on the Central African Republic, which over the decades, if not the centuries, has been ravaged and devastated by the aforementioned French imperialism and French colonialism. But that was not the essence of that article that you referenced. Instead, it focused on the alleged depredations of Russia in the Central African Republic, without any context for the reader in terms of how the Central African Republic has now emerged in 2022 on its knees because of French imperialism. But this also raises a larger question, which your opening helps to reveal and unveil, which is that NATO has played the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded by the United States and its North Atlantic allies in the late 1940s, as a Cold War prop, which suggests that it should have gone into the dustbin of history with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, but instead has motored on. We know that during its inglorious history from 1949 up to the present, that NATO has collaborated with South African apartheid in terms of trying to forestall the independence of South Africa under Nelson Mandela. And by way of contrast, it's useful to look at the experience of Russia in Africa, because we know that a major contradiction of European history is that as the Western European nations were getting fat and wealthy off the plunder of Africa, speaking of the Iberian nations, Spain and Portugal, France, the UK, etc., that the contradiction in the continent was that they were not necessarily the major power in their own backyard. That was Russia, which today has a population of about 150 million. Number 2 is Germany with 82 million. And so that led to repeated efforts to reverse that trajectory of history. You saw that 200 years ago with Napoleon, who was defeated soundly in the early 19th century in an attempt to conquer Russia, up to Operation Barbarossa by Adolf Hitler in 1941 to his inglorious end in 1945. At the same time that the Western European nations were expanding westward across the Atlantic to plunder the Americas and southward into Africa to plunder Africa, Russia was moving east. Its window on the Pacific, speaking of Vladivostok, was established about 1860. And Russia saw it as useful to try to blunt the challenges from its Western neighbors by supporting those who were struggling against its Western neighbors. Recall what happens in the 1890s when Ethiopia, the then solitary, sovereign, independent African nation, repels an Italian invasion that was repeated in the 1930s. The reason that Italian invasion was repelled in the 1890s was precisely because that Ethiopia had been armed to the teeth by Moscow. that continued in the 20th century, where we saw Moscow, in conjunction with its Cuban allies, defeat the apartheid army on the battlefield of southern Angola, which turned the tide for the entire liberation of the southern cone of the continent. And so Washington still has a bone to pick with Moscow, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that helps to explain and undergird that unfortunate article that you referenced appearing in the New York Times just a few days ago.
I want to just go to the future, if you will. And that is, we start again with Nkrumah and Walter Rodney and others who warned in the 60s and 70s of NATO and its relationship and colonialist and hegemonistic endeavors in the African continent. Well, now what we've seen is, and I want you to help us understand that, NATO continues that in the form of African, who I believe is facilitating wars and instability and the corporate pillage of Africa. Your thoughts on understanding African, in case people are confused that this is somehow a part of self-determination, that African is a manifestation of self-determination for the African population, which is really where we're going with this in any event, and that is for the integrity and self-determination of the continent of Africa to make its own decisions about whom it allies with.
Well, it's well that you mentioned AFRICOM, the so-called African Command, which is the Pentagon's mailed fist on the African continent. AFRICOM is designed to prop up French neocolonialism and help to execute Washington's own designs with regard to controlling the vast natural resources and wealth of Africa, speaking of the aforementioned natural gas of Algeria and Nigeria, the petroleum of Angola, the gold of the erstwhile Gold Coast, now Ghana, for example. It's also important to recognize that the Africa Command, AFRICOM, has a similarly nefarious purpose, which is to co-opt the Black American community. That is to say, it's no accident that the leader of AFRICOM is a top-ranking U.S. general who happens to be of African origin. Speaking of Michael Langley, hopefully his surname is coincidence, and that he being carrying the same surname as the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency in Virginia is a kind of accident. But this attempt to co-opt the Black American community with regard to the evil designs of U.S. imperialism in Africa is no accident. It's not of recent vintage. What I'm referring to, of course, is the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, West Africa, in February 1966, which took place at the same time that the U.S. ambassador to Ghana was Franklin Williams, a former leader of the NAACP, also of African ancestry. And so this attempt to co-opt this Black American community is ongoing. In my book that you mentioned in the introduction, White Supremacy Confronted, which deals with the role of U.S. imperialism and trying to forestall the independence of the southern cone of Africa, I mentioned that in the 1950s, you had NAACP leaders who were trying to flip leaders of the African National Congress, turn them into CIA agents. This is reflected in their correspondence, which is housed at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. I'm surprised it hasn't been purged. So this design of AFRICOM that you mentioned is nothing new. It's ongoing, but I'm happy to say that it is destined and doomed for failure.
And I want you to just analyze for us why you think that the New York Times, again, published. I'm harping on it because I thought it was just, again, remarkable to have a 3-page diatribe, an absolute propaganda piece in a state of absolute critique and horror to try to, again, deal with Putin's, as they call it, Putin's Russia and the relationship to the African continent. How do you think, why did that play out? Why did they allow for that propaganda piece? And what do you think it has to do with, if anything, but I certainly think it does, the U.S. efforts to continue to now not only go back on what was supposed to be the dismantling of NATO, but the continuation of NATO and the war in Ukraine. And that's a whole hell of a lot, but I know you're up to the task.
Well, fortunately, the New York Times had the good sense to publish a letter in the last 24 to 48 hours from a dissenter who pointed out some of the same issues that you've referenced with regard to that unfortunate piece. And I think that once again, you cannot understand that diatribe against not only Africa generally, but the Central African Republic more specifically, without understanding the hysteria of the North Atlantic nations, because as they survey the landscape, they detect a rising China in alliance with Russia. You may recall that former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said that a central objective of U.S. foreign policy is to drive a wedge between Moscow and Washington. That occurred about a half century ago when Kissinger and Nixon went to China and effectuated an anti-Soviet détente with the Chinese leadership. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that anti-Soviet entente basically lost its relevance. And then we know that in the meantime, the United States opened its coffers and allowed massive foreign direct investment to be poured into China, which has now created this juggernaut. So the United States would like to reverse that tide of history, which then leads us back to this conflict in Ukraine, because as Washington sees it, it will be difficult to bring China to its knees unless Russia is brought to its knees initially, because Russia is a kind of firewall that is serving as a kind of protective device that delays Washington's ultimate confrontation with China. It's no secret, as certain organs of the press have reported, that one of the reasons why Russia has been able to survive this onslaught of sanctions from the United States and its North Atlantic allies is because of under-the-table and over-the-table assistance from Beijing. And you see that Russia is now selling its energy increasingly into Asia, not only into China, but into India as well, which refuses to go along with the sanctions regime, as does a good deal of Africa, which brings us once again back full circle to the legislation by Congressman Gregory Meeks of Southeast Queens seeking to punish and sanction African nations who refuse to go along with this Ukraine escapade.
And I think we have about 30 seconds to wind this up.
Well, I would just say in closing that thank you for inviting me, and let us hope in 2023 we can keep the spotlight and the floodlight on this major question of U.S. imperialism's depredations on the African continent.
And people simply must read White Supremacy Confronted, one of the many books, but most pertinent to this discussion, of Dr. Gerald Horne. And we're going to go out with Janine again, just to remind people of the work that we have in the year to come around supporting self-determination for Africa, ending the war in Ukraine in any event, and definitely supporting a free Palestine. I'm Mimi Rosenberg with great thanks to the people's historian, Dr. Gerald Horne. It's been a pleasure as always. Thank you for educating, agitating, and organizing us. Mimi Rosenberg saying, have a great new year. We've got a lot of work to do, and with people like Gerald Horne, they give us the tools to do it. Thanks for listening.